May 1940. German forces control the majority of Europe. Poland was crushed in weeks. France fell in 40 days. The British army was driven into the sea at Dunkirk. Germany appeared unstoppable. Panzer wagons rolled through Paris. Swastikas flew over the Channel Islands. The Third Reich reached its peak 5 years later. Berlin is a graveyard of scorched stone. The German army has ceased to exist. The leadership is dead in an underground bunker. The country is divided, partitioned, and occupied by 4 foreign powers. How did the situation reverse so completely? It was not bad luck. It was not superior enemy tactics on the front lines. It was not the atomic bomb. That weapon was never used on European soil. This was systematic strategic incompetence. It occurred on a scale the world had never seen before. Between 1940 and 1945, a series of decisions was made. Each one was worse than the last. These choices turned a position of strength into a catastrophic defeat. 10 strategic blunders destroyed the most powerful military machine in history. These were not battlefield accidents. They were errors in logic. These mistakes made total defeat mathematically inevitable. At first glance, a series of random errors, but in reality, a connected chain of failure. Each blunder made the next mistake more likely. Each failure stripped away German resources. By 1943, the trajectory was locked. The path led to only one possible outcome. Could Germany have won if just one of these decisions had been different? The facts suggest a specific answer. The footage from the era shows the scale of the collapse. The archives contain the orders that led to the ruins. The first error was the most significant. It remains the single greatest missed opportunity in military history. Events accelerated quickly after this moment. There was no turning back. The first blunder began not with a defeat, but with a hesitation. The German High Command paused when they should have struck. This decision changed the direction of the entire century. The story begins in the summer of 1940. The sun was out. The British were trapped. The trap was set, but the door remained open. June 1940. France signed the surrender papers. The British army fled through the port of Dunkirk, leaving thousands of trucks and tanks rotting on the sand. Britain stood alone. Adolf Hitler controlled the entire European coastline from the fjords of Norway down to the Spanish border. The Wehrmacht was the most lethal land force on the planet. Why did Germany hesitate? The British were at their weakest point in history. The answer reveals a structural flaw in the German military. This single weakness eventually cost them the war. But first, the scale of the threat must be clear. The Luftwaffe held a massive numerical advantage in total airframe counts. However, the math was deceptive. German Messerschmitts had limited range. Pilots checked their fuel gauges constantly. They could only stay over British soil for 20 minutes before the engines went dry. Meanwhile, British factories worked 24 hours a day. They manufactured new Spitfires and Hurricanes faster than the Germans could shoot them down. July 16, 1940. Hitler issued Directive No. 16. This was the birth of Operation Sea Lion. The invasion date was set for September. But the plan relied on 3 rigid conditions. First, the Luftwaffe had to clear the skies over the English Channel. Second, the Kriegsmarine had to protect the transport ships from the Royal Navy. Third, heavy artillery had to lock down the Strait of Dover. The footage from the time shows the reality. German soldiers practiced boarding river barges in the occupied ports. These weren't ocean-going vessels. They were flat-bottomed boats meant for calm inland waters. The sound of struggling diesel engines filled the harbors. There was no turning back. At first glance, a massive invasion force, but in reality, a logistical nightmare. The German Navy lacked the destroyers to guard the flanks. The British home fleet waited in the north with overwhelming firepower. Germany gathered 9,000 elite troops for the first wave. But without total control of the air, they were sitting ducks. Events decelerated. The German High Command realized the Channel was not a river. It was a moat. The plan began to crumble before the first soldier stepped onto a boat. Thus began the wait. July 10, 1940. The Luftwaffe launched the Battle of Britain. Waves of Heinkel and Dornier bombers targeted British airfields. The goal was simple: Destroy the Royal Air Force on the ground before they could take off. It didn't work. The RAF fought back. The sound of Merlin engines filled the sky. In the video, we see burning wreckage in the English countryside, but something unexpected happened. The longer the battle lasted, the stronger the British became. Why did the British grow stronger? It seemed impossible under constant bombardment, but the answer was industrial speed. Factories churned out Spitfires and Hurricanes faster than Germany could shoot them down. American supplies began arriving in crates at the docks. Pilots from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and across the Commonwealth joined the squadrons. By September, the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. The invasion was postponed. Then it was postponed again. And then Germany made a decision that changed the course of the war. They gave up. At first glance, a tactical pause, but in reality, a total shift in strategy. The invasion was never formally canceled, but the maps were rolled up. By late 1940, the German High Command had moved on to other plans. There was no turning back. Here is the fact most people miss. The problem wasn't just the failed airstrikes. The real problem was internal. The German Army, Navy, and Air Force could not agree on how to invade in the first place. The Kriegsmarine was a continental navy. It was designed for coastal defense, not the open ocean. It had zero experience with large-scale amphibious operations. The footage shows their invasion fleet, a disorganized collection of river barges, tugboats, and converted merchant ships. These were flat-bottomed boats meant for the Rhine, not the English Channel. The Luftwaffe, the Army, and the Navy were essentially planning 3 different invasions at once. They didn't share intelligence. They didn't coordinate logistics. They couldn't even agree on a landing zone. The German military was a machine with 3 different steering wheels. Thus ended the dream of a cross-channel invasion. Berlin failed to understand the scale of the operation. They lacked the specialized equipment for a cross-channel invasion. Britain survived. That single fact guaranteed Germany would lose the war. Every month Britain remained in the fight. The situation for the Reich worsened. American supplies poured into British ports. The docks were crowded with crates of ammunition, tanks, and fuel. British factories moved to a 24-hour cycle. Production numbers climbed. Britain became a permanent, unsinkable base for future Allied operations. 1944. The D-Day landings launched from the English coast. 1943. American bombers began leveling German cities. The planes took off from British airfields. Germany was forced to drain its resources to defend the French coast. This happened because Britain provided the springboard for the invasion. But German leadership ignored these risks in the summer of 1940. They were preparing a different path. A decision so catastrophic, it would define the remainder of the conflict. They chose to invade the largest country on Earth while Britain was still in the fight. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa began. At 3:15 in the morning, the silence broke. Artillery fired. Over 3 million German troops crossed the Soviet border. It was the largest military invasion in human history. The German High Command made a specific prediction. They estimated the war would end in 6 to 8 weeks. Hitler was confident. He stated that they only needed to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure would come crashing down. He was wrong. The mistake was historic. It was a failure that changed the course of civilization. Why did the professionals make such a gamble? At first glance, it looks like a tactical error. But in reality, it was the moment political ideology destroyed strategic reality. The evidence is visible in the invasion plan itself. The German General Staff performed the math. They calculated that the Soviet Union possessed massive manpower reserves. Their official estimate stated the Soviets could mobilize 2 million reserve troops over 6 months. The actual number was different. The Soviets mobilized 4 million men in just 10 days. The German intelligence was off. The scale of the miscalculation was total: 600 miles. That was the distance from the German border to Moscow. German logistics officers ran the numbers. They delivered a formal warning. Their trucks and supply lines could only sustain an invasion for 300 miles. Beyond that point, the system would break. Professional military planners looked at the data and reached a consensus. The operation was impossible. The invasion proceeded anyway. Why did the command ignore the math? It wasn't a mistake of calculation, it was an ideological assumption. The leadership believed the Soviet state was a rotten structure. They expected it to collapse under the first blow. They viewed the Slavic population as inferior. They dismissed Soviet officers as incompetent. Every one of these assumptions was false. The footage from June 1941 shows the initial surge, but the scene changes by December. In the frame, German soldiers are shivering. They wear thin summer uniforms in sub-zero temperatures. Supply trucks are frozen in the mud. The quick victory never happened. The Soviet government remained in the Kremlin. Stalin stayed in his office. Instead of a collapse, a counterattack began. Germany was now trapped. They were fighting on two fronts, the British Empire to the west and the Soviet Union to the east. This violated every strategic principle in military history. You do not open a second front before closing the first. It is a fundamental rule of war. Germany broke it. Events accelerated. 5 months later, the situation became even more inexplicable. By December 1941, two fronts were not enough. Germany was about to open a third, December 11th, 1941. This is the date military historians still struggle to explain. Germany declared war on the United States of America. It was a voluntary act. At first glance, the tripartite pact forced their hand. But in reality, Germany had no obligation to join a war started by Japan at Pearl Harbor. The treaty was defensive. It did not apply to an offensive strike. Why take the risk? The answer reveals one of the greatest intelligence failures in history. December 7th, 1941. Japan strikes Pearl Harbor. One day later, the United States declares war on the Japanese Empire. The global map shifted instantly. Germany watched from Berlin. Their alliance with Japan, the Tripartite Pact, was a defensive treaty. Article 3 of the document was specific. Germany was only obligated to intervene if a third party attacked Japan. In this case, Japan was the clear aggressor. Adolf Hitler had a legal exit. He could have remained neutral in the Pacific conflict. December 11th, 1941. 4 days after the attack, Germany declared war on the United States anyway. This decision changed the scale of the conflict. It was a mathematical catastrophe for the Third Reich. The United States possessed the largest industrial economy on the planet. American factory floors were vast. Production lines ran 24 hours a day. Within months, these plants could outproduce German industry by a ratio of 4-to-1. The physical reality was even worse. Germany lacked the tools for a transatlantic war. They had no navy capable of crossing the ocean. They had no long-range bombers capable of reaching Washington or New York. No German soldier could set foot on North American soil. But the United States could reach Germany. At first glance, Germany looked invincible in Europe, but in reality, they were now vulnerable from every direction. The footage from the era shows the scale. American shipyards launched hulls every few days. B-17 bombers rolled off assembly lines in thousands. These planes could reach Berlin. These ships could keep Britain fed and armed. These soldiers could land on European beaches. The strategic calculus was a disaster. Germany declared war on an enemy it could not touch. But that same enemy possessed the reach to destroy them. Why did the German leadership take this risk? It seemed like a calculated move, but it was a blind leap. There was a hidden factor in play. 9 months before the bombs fell on Hawaii, secret meetings took place in Washington. March 1941. British and American military officers gathered behind closed doors. They called these the ABC-1 conferences. The two nations reached a secret agreement. If the United States entered the conflict, they would follow a specific doctrine. Their primary strategic objective was not Japan. Events accelerated. The plan was titled Germany First. Even if the Pacific burned, the Americans and British agreed to focus their full industrial and military weight on the defeat of the Third Reich. Hitler had declared war on a nation that had already decided his destruction was their top priority. There was no turning back. December 11th, 1941. Germany declared war on the United States. They expected a distracted enemy. They were wrong. The Americans already had a plan. It was called Europe First. This strategy made Germany the primary target for total destruction. The plan focused the full weight of American industrial power on the German military. It was not a theory. It was a signed and finalized strategic framework. By declaring war, Hitler activated an Allied machine designed specifically to crush him. Within hours of the declaration, the United States Congress gathered. The air in the room was heavy. The Senate held its vote. The result, 88-0. Then came the House of Representatives. The result, 393-0. Not a single dissenting vote was cast. How did the mood change so fast? At first glance, a nation divided by isolationism, but in reality, a unified war machine. Germany's declaration did what the White House could not do alone. It erased all internal opposition in one afternoon. The country was now a single unit. The situation for Berlin turned grim. Germany was now fighting Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States simultaneously. This was a war on three fronts. But the Soviet front was about to expose a fatal intelligence error. Something was happening deep in the Russian interior. German intelligence officers said it was impossible. It wasn't. Events accelerated. Most history books skip this specific chapter. It explains why Germany lost the Eastern Front before the first decisive battle even began. This is the record of the greatest industrial feat in human history. In the summer of 1941, German panzers moved east. But behind the Soviet lines, the landscape was changing. Thousands of Soviet workers arrived at their factories. They didn't just grab tools, they began disassembling entire buildings. They unbolted heavy presses from concrete floors. They packed every gear and every motor into crates. It wasn't just equipment being moved, it was the entire Soviet industrial system. The sound of metal grinding on metal filled the air. Thousands of steam engines waited on the tracks. This was a forced migration of steel. There was no turning back. June 1941. The German Wehrmacht crossed the Soviet border. They targeted the industrial heart of the nation. But the Soviets had a plan. They dismantled everything: buildings, heavy machinery, engineers, and archives. They loaded the pulse of their economy onto freight cars. These trains traveled hundreds of miles. Some traveled thousands. Take the Kharkov tank factory. This facility was the birthplace of the T-34. It was the most effective armored vehicle in the Soviet arsenal. By late summer, German panzers were closing in on the city limits. Soviet planners issued a single order: move the entire factory. How did they do it? They tore down the walls. They unscrewed the bolts of every heavy press. They packed 10,000 machine tools into wooden crates. 30,000 workers boarded the same trains. The chief designer, Alexander Morozov, stood on the platform. He personally supervised the loading of the blueprints. German shells were already landing in the outskirts. The trains pulled away just as the front line arrived. They moved 2,000 kilometers east. Their destination was the Ural Mountains. This was a land beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe, but moving was only half the battle. Consider the Chelyabinsk steelworks. This plant was critical for armor plating. The state gave the workers 75 days to relocate and resume production. They did not take 75 days. They finished the job in 56. Was it easy? No. It was a brutal race against time. They disassembled a massive steel mill and transported it across a continent. They rebuilt it in less than 2 months. The footage from this era shows the reality. Workers lived in canvas tents. They slept on frozen ground. This was a Siberian winter. They laid miles of new railway tracks. They reassembled 18 massive machine shops. They connected complex compressed air systems and high-voltage lines. They worked while temperatures dropped to 30 degrees below zero. But this effort changed the war. By late 1941, these relocated factories were back online. They were pumping out tanks, aircraft, and shells at a relentless pace. The production numbers are staggering. In 1942, the Soviet Union manufactured 24,851 tanks. During that same year, Germany produced 5,452. This is not a clerical error. The Soviets built nearly 5 tanks for every single German vehicle. At first glance, it looked like a retreat. But in reality, it was a logistical victory. The machines won the war before the soldiers did. The industry had survived. Soviet industrial production reached double the German rate. This gap applied to every category. Artillery production favored the Soviets. Small arms production favored the Soviets. Ammunition production favored the Soviets. On the front lines, German forces destroyed Soviet tanks and trucks at a record pace. But it was a mathematical trap. The Red Army was losing equipment faster than the Germans, but Germany could not replace its own losses. Soviet production numbers continued to climb. American intelligence noticed a detail that German intelligence completely missed. In late 1940 and early 1941, the signals were there. American military attachés in Moscow filed urgent reports. They documented a massive movement of heavy machinery. They recorded thousands of skilled workers boarding trains headed east toward the Ural Mountains. The Soviets were preparing months before Operation Barbarossa began. They anticipated the invasion. Stalin was moving the entire industrial heart of the country out of reach. By the time the first shots were fired, Germany was already fighting an enemy with superior manufacturing capacity and nearly unlimited manpower. But production does not win every battle. Soldiers do. Strategy does. Professional military leadership decides the outcome. This is where the next German blunder occurred. A shift in command structure changed everything. The Soviets were finally learning to trust their generals. Germany was doing the exact opposite. Historically, the German military relied on a doctrine called Auftragstaktik. In English, this means mission-based command. The concept was straightforward. A high-ranking officer gave a subordinate an objective. The subordinate had total freedom to decide how to achieve that goal. There was no micromanagement. This system made the German army the most effective fighting force in 1939 and 1940. It allowed for speed and local initiative. But by 1942, that system was dead. It had been dismantled from the top down. The footage from the era shows the change. General staff meetings became lectures. Hitler began to dictate the movement of individual battalions from a map thousands of miles away. The era of flexible command was over. Summer 1942, German forces began a massive advance toward two targets, the city of Stalingrad and the oil fields of the Caucasus. The plan required splitting the available forces between these two distant objectives. Logistics experts warned of the risk. It was a fatal move. There was no turning back. Professional military officers argue this violates basic doctrine. A commander does not divide his strength during an attack. The order comes down anyway. Split the forces. This happened repeatedly in December 1941. German forces are outside Moscow. They are trapped in the middle of a brutal Russian winter. Temperatures drop to 40 below zero. Generals request permission to withdraw to defensive positions. They want to regroup and wait for spring. The answer from the top is a single word: no. Hold every position. No retreats. Thousands of German soldiers froze to death holding ground with no strategic value. Logistics failed. The grease in the rifles froze solid. Tank engines refused to start. Equipment broke down and was abandoned in the snow. Entire units were destroyed, defending positions that could have been retaken later. Professional military judgment was replaced with ideological determination. How did the high command react? They ignored the casualty reports. The maps in Berlin did not show the piles of frozen bodies. They only showed lines that could not move back. The Soviets did the exact opposite. In 1941, Stalin made the same mistake. He refused to allow retreats. He ordered units to hold pointless positions until they were encircled. Soviet casualties were catastrophic. Millions of men were lost in the first months of the invasion. But by 1943, Stalin had learned. He stopped executing his commanders for every setback. He began trusting his generals. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky were given operational freedom. They were allowed to plan maneuvers based on geography and math, not politics. Soviet military planning became increasingly professional. Meanwhile, the German command structure became more rigid. It became more dysfunctional. It was divorced from military reality. Hitler took personal control of small units. He demanded reports on every battalion. At first glance, two dictatorships, but in reality, two opposite directions. The two systems effectively crossed paths. The professional German military became a tool for an amateur's obsessions. The Soviet military moved from amateur panic to professional execution. The footage from the front shows the result: long columns of German prisoners walking east through the snow. This was the turning point. The professional German military was now a shadow of its former self. August 1942. The German war machine reached the banks of the Volga River. Ahead lay Stalingrad. The city held immense symbolic weight because it carried the name of Joseph Stalin. For Adolf Hitler, capturing it promised a massive propaganda victory. But why prioritize this target? Strategically, the city was secondary. The real prize lay hundreds of miles to the south in the Caucasus oil fields. Germany was running out of fuel. Without that oil, the tanks would stop. But the German leadership became obsessed with the name on the map. They pulled elite divisions into the city streets. This was urban combat. It was house to house and room to room. In these narrow ruins, German advantages in speed, tanks, and aircraft vanished. The war turned into a meat grinder. Why did the generals continue the assault? At first glance, a tactical necessity, but in reality, a trap fueled by ego. The Soviet military was changing. The old ideological officers were being replaced by professional commanders. They stopped retreating and started planning. They watched the German army pour its strength into the city center. While the Germans fought for every pile of bricks, the Soviets looked at the map. They saw a weakness. The German flanks were stretched thin. These vital lines were not held by German veterans. Instead, they were manned by Romanian and Italian units. These troops lacked heavy anti-tank weapons and the will to die for Hitler's prestige. November 19, 1942. Operation Uranus began. The Soviets did not strike the city. They struck the weak flanks. Massive artillery barrages tore through the Romanian lines. The sound of thousands of Katyusha rockets filled the air. The flanks did not just bend, they collapsed. The footage shows Soviet T-34 tanks charging through the snow at full speed. They bypassed the street fighting entirely. Armored columns drove deep into the German rear. On November 23rd, the two Soviet pincers met west of the city. The trap snapped shut. Suddenly, 300,000 German and Axis soldiers were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. They were surrounded in a frozen pocket of land. No supplies, no reinforcements, no way out. It was the single greatest disaster in German military history. It shattered the myth of invincibility forever, not through a single battle, but through a calculated encirclement. There was no turning back. November 23rd and 24th. General Friedrich Paulus faced a choice. He could attempt a breakout or wait for orders. He sent a message to the high command. He waited for a response while his men froze in the trenches. The decision made in those 48 hours sealed the fate of an entire army.